First of all, over in the chair over here, there's an outline and there's some summary of where we've been before, which I don't know how orderly it is, but there it is anyway. And the summary actually would be, I think, kind of helpful to draw us maybe into the topic that we're going to deal with this evening. We began in this whole series and began with asking the question, how does humanity actually know who it is, where it comes from, and what its destiny is? And we said that in order for that to be known, there has to be in the beginning some kind of a given. You can't start out of nowhere. There has to be a given. And essentially then we looked and tried to discuss in a way the whole nature of the mythological structures of human understanding and the whole mythological structures of how humanity grapples with the question of identity, destiny, origin, and so forth. We saw, for instance, that then in the beginning of Revelation encountered the ancient mythologies. And the place where that becomes most clear what that relationship is in the beginning of the book of Genesis, when in fact Revelation informed the Babylonian mythology and brought out of that mythology and revealed interpretation of meaning, of origin, and of destiny. The first topic was humanity seeks to know the gods. From this moment on, there was a struggle then within humanity for it to arrive at a deeper understanding, a deeper comprehension of how this revelation informs historical mythology and how it turns it into a truthful reflection and truthful self-understanding. The second topic was humanity seeks to overcome the gods. And there we watched humanity come to a point, actually, where they seem to have grown tired of the given of revelation. We talked about it in kind of modern philosophical terms as being's self-revelation, and how, first of all, they began to deny the possibility of the knowability of being itself. And once being, or in our language, God, was pushed beyond the horizon into a darkness, then something had to begin to replace that given, that primordial mythology. And we looked at the role that rationalism played in that, and we looked at the role also that the breaking of the synthesis in the Renaissance and in the Reformation. And we saw that the given then began to lose any existential grounding at all. It became simply an intellectual or a private and subjective phenomenon. We see it clearly in the breakdown of the integrity of Scripture during the Reformation, when, as a matter of fact, the gospel narrative was passé, pushed aside, and only the Pauline post-resurrection understanding of Christ as Spirit remained. And you know that when there is not a concrete existential other in our lives, we have free range of our imagination and our mind to scan through the realities that we encounter and to impose upon those spiritual realities our own kind of understanding, structure, imagery, all of that kind of thing. It's like, you know, when you find someone who doesn't believe in organized religion but is a spiritual person, when you push them far enough, you'll find out the spirit that they turn to looks enormously like themselves. What they have done is projected their ideal selves into this spirit and then actually become self-directing and actually self-worshipping creatures who have an absolute sense of their personal truth. And it is non-negotiable, usually without substance and usually without the capacity to hold its own in any kind of a discussion other than how I feel about it. Along with that came a deadly idea in the Reformation, that of the individual predestination. And I think I read a passage there out of Msgr and the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, in which he traces what happens to the human person when predestination becomes the sense of their destiny, the one that they can never truly know for sure. And so there's all sorts of artificial structures set up in that definition to assure them. Then we looked a little bit, very little bit, at the Enlightenment. And basically, the Enlightenment is where reality is developed into a mechanistic system. Everything is concrete cause and effect. It starts with Descartes, it goes into the physics of Newton, and all of these kinds of stuff. A mechanistic understanding of everything about us. And we know, for instance, this is very clearly as it weaves its way into the post-Enlightenment age, it is in many ways a foundation of at least popular psychology, if not in the more refined or sophisticated senses of it. That I remember a psychologist one time telling me the only difference between me and a car mechanic is he works on a car and I work on people. We are mechanical beings in the Enlightenment rationalism. And that you always have, I don't know if you've heard of B.F. Skinner and the Skinner box and all of this kind of thing, the development of the psychological profession, that response, Pavlovian dogs and so forth, stimulus and response is how you train the human person. And then we looked a little bit to the creation of the subjective given as a philosophical principle in the 18th through the 20th century in German philosophy. And it is there, then, that we look at God is finally defeated in the Western culture. And that, as a matter of fact, instead of the given being self-revelation to humanity, then instead of that, the given becomes the self. I put a quote in here from Nietzsche's Will to Power. It says, in short, the question remains open. Are the axioms of logic adequate to reality? It means that they conform to reality. Or are they means and measure for us to create reality? The concept reality for ourselves. To affirm the former, and that is that logic is adequate for reality, one would, as already said, have to have a previous knowledge of being, which is certainly not the case. We saw in St. Bernard and in many of in much of the coming to awakening in the Middle Ages, the idea of the tripartite soul, the memory, the will, and the intellect, the memory possessing almost kind of a preconscious or an unconscious knowledge of reality, which is actualized by the given. And then the proposition, then he goes on to say they'd have to have a previous knowledge of being, which is certainly not the case. The proposition, therefore, contains no criterion of truth, but an imperative concerning that which should be considered as true. In other words, our reason, ourselves, create the given, and that it has nothing that precedes it. There is no pre-consciousness, there is no communication of being, of God. There is no self-revelation of the divine. In this paper, then, that I put out for you, I have a couple pages, maybe, of summary. And in that summary, I end up with the turn of the German philosophers back to Greek tragedy as being, going back to the classical period. And just to go that the triumph of the Übermensch was realized in its own destruction. Thus they charted a course of return to the pagan classics of the Greek world, especially Greek tragedy. In Greek tragedy, chaos, human wisdom, and human creativity meet. And in the end, only chaos remains. And then I have a paragraph that is going to introduce us to the real topic for this evening, which is the phenomenon of our culture, the American phenomenon. And so I say, I'll just read the paragraph and then we'll start. Before the cycle was complete of the return to chaos, that is, the small group of Englishmen of the book, because we saw how in the Reformation, Scripture alone, Luther turned away from the Logos, the Word, the person, as the origin of revelation, and returned to the Bible, the book. And the book was subjected to human interpretation, multiple interpretations, and so it became under the control of the human mind, and that it no longer drew us beyond the printed page, which is what Mohammed saw within Christianity, was they called them the people of the book. We are not people of the book. We are people of the Word. We are people of the Logos. We are people who are connected to the person of the Word of God, of the second person of the Blessed Trinity. Before the cycle was complete, a small group of Englishmen of the book escaped the cascading misfortunes of Europe and fled to North America. There they attempted to bring with them the rule of the book and the reason of their age, the reason of the Enlightenment. America was born. Its task was to find a way to live and thrive after the overcoming of the Logos. Despite the religious veneer of the new experiment, the task was to form a society that could live without the living presence of the eternal God, that could live with reason and the book, not with the Logos. And we know all the role that the Bible has played in the development of Protestant America. It is the book that they relied on. The individual became the given, and reason of the book became the building blocks of a new society, free from the tyranny of the given and open to the impending encounter with the abyss. The American myth was born, and it flourished. The question is, how did it do this, and how is it doing? First, I would like to turn back to the writings of John Locke. Thomas Jefferson, in his early writings, liked to establish his independence from the Englishmen and to identify himself essentially then as, as a whole new breed of character. But there is no argument that the English Enlightenment was very much a part of the American experiment. We have a very excellent American historian with us here, Father Enders, and if I say anything wrong, correct me. But quietly. The thing with Locke is this, and I'd like to turn to an important quote. What Locke tried to do was to justify a coup d'etat, which of course in typical English terms they called it the Glorious Revolution. In normal terms, it was a coup d'etat. They threw the king out. This was unthinkable, so he had to find a way to justify that. And the way that he justified that, and the way that he justified a response and a reaction to the turmoil on the continent, was to replace, in his own way, the given of the old world with private property. That would be the defining characteristic. That would be what distinguished the natural rulers from the unnatural rulers, what would distinguish those who had the insight to govern and those who should be governed. But he carried this idea of private property. It's in the Declaration of Independence. We call it happiness in the Declaration of Independence. But it is derived from property in the Lockean sense. And so Locke then turned away from the idea of natural rights, natural property, from the political, the rights of the governed, and Locke dug into a notion of the individual rights that existed within the very nature of the human person. So begins now, at the end of the 17th century, begins now the redefinition of human nature. We saw in the informing of the Babylonian myth in Genesis that human nature is defined as a participation in divine being, the imago Dei, the image of God. Now the recreation, the re-identification, the re-understanding rationally of the human person. Locke began to define the individual from a creature belonging to its creator to a creature belonging to itself. The self and the individual now stands at the center of Locke's philosophy of private property. Persons were unlike inanimate objects that could easily be possessed by another. People, Locke argued, belonged to themselves. He arrived at that conclusion by observation and experience. Quote, human beings uniquely find their identity in self-consciousness. That is, in the consciousness of the self, of the I, persisting over time, which stands as the basis for the unity of experience, intention, and the action of the person. The I is not anything given in nature. It is made by the self in the course of its operations of sensation and reflection. Other animals have no I center, and human beings themselves develop the I consciousness only over time. Since the self creates the I of the person, it is owned by its creator, and therefore the I implies self-ownership. The foundation or ground of rights is, according to Locke, self-ownership of the person. How different that is from being self-revelation as it informs early creation mythology and as it tells us and reinterprets the human person and reinterprets God himself for us. Now, on the foundation or ground of rights is, according to Locke, self-ownership. This ownership implies that a person is his or her own property, and the fundamental right to private property begins with the ownership of the self. How often have we admiringly heard of the self-made men and women? How deeply do we feel the right to chart our own course and to be in charge of our own destiny? And I think I mentioned this before, but it's really interesting. When I was a kid, my father tried to make us cultured, and with very little success, I think. But he went through this phase where we had to memorize poetry and then recite it at the dinner table. And one of the poems that he was a great fan of Victorian literature, actually. And one of the poems I remember is a poem called Invictus, if you are familiar with that at all. And it says, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. Now, the last time that gained public hearing was on television, several years ago. And actually, it was the last words to the public of Timothy McVeigh, the one who had blown up the government building in Oklahoma City. This is what he quoted on his way to execution. I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. Now, this sense of right of private property becomes critical in the early 1970s. Because this, in the debate over Roe v. Wade, this was what Justice Douglas said. He said, we are dealing here with a penumbra of privacy. The Lockean sense of the self as private property lies at the very root of Roe v. Wade. The entire abortion argument centers on the notion of a woman's right over her own body. If you can argue that the unborn child is part of a woman's body, the argument need go no further in traditional English and American political theory, because the woman has a right to own and dispose of her private property as she sees fit. Now, this is the very same argument that was used, and John Locke wrote the constitutions for the colonies of North Carolina and South Carolina. And in that, he justified slavery using exactly the same notion of the right of private property. Because how this developed in England was, if you were a dependent of any kind, you were not entitled to yourself. If you remember, for instance, in the Continental Congress, one of the early drafts of what was to become the Constitution was that no one had a right to vote unless they were at least a 200-shilling freeholder. In other words, you had to have 200 shillings worth of property in order to receive civil rights, enfranchisement. In England, that's exactly what happened to the indentured servants, to women, to children, to the disabled, all of them. They were not owners of themselves, and therefore they did not enjoy the rights, the civil rights of the Englishman. That was transported over here. And as it was transported over here through the writings, especially of Thomas Jefferson, but others as well, the notion of the penumbra of privacy, of the person as being their own private property. So that if you can argue, for instance, in the secular world, if you can argue, well, the fetus in the womb has its own DNA, it's a separate person, the legal argument would come back, but it's not self-sustaining, and therefore it does not have a right. Only the one it is dependent on has the right. Now, we have overcome this prejudice against the poor, overcome this prejudice against women, overcome this prejudice against children, overcome this prejudice against, in the law at least, against the disabled and so forth. But we have not yet been successfully able to address biological dependency as a civil rights issue. And it's going to be very hard to do that because the dependent in this case is clearly in the possession of another. It's not a legal contract, it's a biological contract. And that's where we have to go with this argument, and we don't really go there. But it was the same argument that was used for slavery, and the same argument then, again, that was used in Roe v. Wade. And it stems from Locke's two treatises on government in the 17th century, the end of the 17th century, in trying to find a justification for the coup d'etat in 1688 in England, and also as a way to avoid the conflict that had developed in England in the English Civil War about who are the elect. It was a Puritan versus a Cavalier conflict. And the answer seemed to be whoever was more powerful. Locke says there has to be a better way to do this, and so he does away with the whole structure and makes everyone independent, everyone themselves, everyone isolated individual. There's a book by C.B. Macpherson called Possessive Individualism, and it's a very clear kind of favorable to the idea, but of the kind of possessive individualism that is very much a part of the English legacy. And I think that's something that we grapple with. Our governmental structures and our Constitution and so forth do come from the English Enlightenment, and we're guided by the people of the book and not by the people of the Word. So, we have Locke, and we have slavery in the constitutional arguments of Roe v. Wade. Another thing entered into American society. And now there's a very interesting book called The Twilight of the American Enlightenment by George Marsden. It's very good, but it's really interesting to me. He does a very fine analysis, especially in the 40s and 1940s and 1950s. But in the end, in his final chapter, what is it among us? What is it that makes political dialogue impossible in the modern age? What is the non-negotiable question? The non-negotiable question is human life. It is abortion. And when Marsden gets to the final chapter, it's like the elephant is not in the room anymore. It's gone. And so he looks forward with this idea of consensus building and so forth, which we've come to the point that's no longer possible. And what we've come to the point is then where these issues have to be addressed in the public arena. And there's not much opportunity for that because we're driven and we're motivated and we're manipulated by media and by liberal politicians. And whenever you raise these kinds of questions, they have invented a whole new category called hate speech. And we see that happening in Canada. If anyone quotes the scriptures, for instance, on something that disagrees with the political correctness of the Canadian government, they can be arrested for hate speech. And they're using this in the Catholic schools, saying Catholic schools must teach secular morality. They may not teach Catholic morality in the Catholic schools in Canada. One of the problems, of course, is the Canadian government supports the Catholic schools in Canada. But a new characteristic entered in that Marsden also doesn't deal with, I don't think, real effectively. And that is, in the 1930s, 20s and 30s, there was a sympathy toward the European revolutions, and especially toward the Bolshevik Revolution. They knew that the Tsarist regimes were harsh and cruel. And what they believed was that a Lenin and a Stalin were striving for humanitarian goals, striving for a greater equality of pay, a greater equality of person within a new Russia. And so there was a large number, especially of people from the East Coast, principally New York, and that escalated into where the New York Times itself was very much pro-Bolshevik, very much pro-Soviet Union. They said that it was a humanitarian goal, and so it was all right to be supportive. We know that those things are hard to reach. You know, we know that it's difficult to get there. So what they didn't say was some 30 million people. We might have a better world after that, after all, anyway. Then came the Third Reich, and that became then the enemy. Not the 30 million to die in the Ukraine and other parts of Russia, the peasants and so forth, under the regime of Joseph Stalin. But now there was kind of a genocidal edge to Nazism, that Hitler killed between 12 and 13 million people. 6 million of them were Jews. It was a genocidal act. But the other 6 to 7 million were Roman Catholics, priests and nuns, the disabled, homosexuals, and who else was it? What was the other group? Gypsies, yeah, and the gypsies. And so they became then, every category identified by Hitler as worthy of extermination was a category that was considered to be inferior. Now, the ideology that invaded the death camps of the Third Reich was the implementation of research done at New York University under the sponsorship of Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, whose goal was to eliminate the undesirables. And in this eugenics research that went on at New York University, Dr. Mengele, of great fame, was one of its students and one of its ones who took it to the experimental level within the death camps of the Third Reich. Connection that's not popular to make in modern society. While the American cultural elite turned toward the Soviet Union and against Nazi Germany, they began to develop a political philosophy that was based on the foundations of the Russian Revolution, that was based on Marxism. Now, we associate Marxism and communism as the same thing, but they're not exactly the same thing. Marx never envisioned what came in the Soviet Union. But there was a very important influence in American politics, one that influenced many of our contemporary politicians, a man by the name of Herbert Marcuse. He was born a German, taught in Germany, left during the Third Reich, ended up teaching at Brandeis University, and being enormously influential on the political philosophy and political theory at the Ivy League schools. Marcuse started out as a literary critic, but he came upon a very interesting piece when he said he makes a distinction between epic poetry and the novel. He said epic poetry deals with origin and development of the people and culture, while the novel does not focus on the form of life of the people and their development, rather on a sense of longing and striving. The novel indicates, therefore, alienation from social life. This ability to entertain, at least theoretically, an ideal form of existence for humanity, while at the same time living in a far less than ideal condition, produces a sense of the alienation of the artist. Alienation then became the catalyst for social change. The utopian dream became the motivation for social change and political revolution. And how many of the radical social, sexual, cultural revolutionary movements have a foundation in unrealistic and unattainable utopian dreams of some kind of freedom and some kind of idealized society? The issue then is one of the great influence of the German philosophy of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century was to move society from an existential encounter with the self-revelation of being into an idealistic reconstruction of human society, which fed itself then into the Marxist utopianism of saying every time you experience some kind of a chasm between what you want and what you have, it is a motivation for you, individually as a person, to begin to seek a revolutionary change within your personal life or within society. As this kind of Marxist notion, Marcuse's great book is the one-dimensional man, the idea that somehow or other, that it is through, they don't like the word utopian because basically they know that it isn't a convincing word. Utopia comes from the Greek otupos, which simply means nowhere. And that's what Thomas More was striving for when he wrote his work, Utopia, was to show that these dreams that people were having were totally unrealistic. The unreality of the idealization of the possible was a gift to the world from the German philosophers of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And it embedded itself in the Marxist ideology in American politics through the academics in the Ivy League schools, motivated in a great extent by the works of Herbert Marcuse. All of this is going on in our society. All of this, and we recognize pieces of it everywhere. I think we do, don't we? Recognize pieces of it everywhere. The question then becomes, what about religion? Wasn't religion able in any way to counteract this kind of false understanding of rights and this materialistic notion of a utopian revolution? Wasn't it able somehow to counteract? Well, first of all, in Protestant America, they were people of the book. And the book, the Bible, gave them a moral compass for a while. But when the book is unhinged from the Logos, it becomes the property of the human. And it is subjected to multiple interpretations. And the multiple interpretations are not able to give certitude or clarity about human life, human nature, human society. The moral compass was what kept the Constitution in check through the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. It was the Protestants. But when they disintegrated, beginning after this First World War, and certainly after the Second World War, there was no dialectical process between secular society and religion. And what happened is this Lockean materialistic understanding of the origin and nature of human rights and human person. Those things then began in a way to dominate and to push religion into the background. The question would be then, if the Protestants had lost their capacity to hold our society in check against the radical individualism of Locke, against the materialistic utopianism of Marxism, and all of those different movements and phases, where was the Catholic Church? Couldn't the Catholic Church do that? The Catholic Church had kept the idea of the Logos as the source of revelation, both of the book and of the tradition. But the Catholic Church in America was ill-equipped to do that. There is a book on the failure of the book Greeley, Andrew Greeley, of great notoriety, called The American Catholic. It's kind of an ideological work of sociological research, but it shows how the most dominant feature of American Catholicism in the 20th century was its power to assimilate and to excel in American Protestant society. The success was incredible of mainstreaming us into a society which essentially at its root was hostile to us, but which they knew they were hostile to us, but they didn't know why. It is a stunning account of the success of the Catholic school system and the work of the women and the men religious in mainstreaming immigrants into American society. Greeley, of course, all the time idealized all of the avant-garde movements in the church and all of the avant-garde leaders in the church. And he dreamt psychosocial dreams about radical change within the church and the creation then of a true American church, a struggle that Catholicism had had since the days of John Carroll when he was Bishop of Baltimore. This whole idea that we have to leave behind and adapt the new. We have to be like them. And if we're like them, we will succeed. Archbishop John Ireland of Minneapolis was exactly the same, one of the worst of the lot. Carroll was not a whole lot better. And it became part and parcel of the struggle within the American church. Are we Catholic or are we a Catholic version of Protestantism? The Americanists felt that we were a Catholic version of Protestantism. And they bought into all of the theory, and some still do, all of the theory that originated in the English Enlightenment. Second to that, they also had a very practical task in this country, the Catholic Church did. We were being flooded with immigrants. Somebody had to look after their well-being. And that became also the work of the Catholic Church, and entered into a colossal, not only educational system that mainstreamed the immigrants, but of a brick-and-mortar phase of our existence. That you had to keep building, building, building to absorb the vast waves of immigrants that came in. And so the Catholic Church in America became kind of a vast construction company. And that what it did is, it's amazing what we were able to do. But through it all, there was a deterioration of this ancient notion that it is the self-revelation of being that informs human mythology and allows it to reflect the truth. We began to lose that. And in 1960, in Dallas, Texas, John Kennedy made a dramatic speech, which all of us thought was a great idea at the time. It least most people thought it was a great idea at the time, that, my religion, were there, we showed the Protestants the Pope's not coming to rule America after all, that we're real Americans too. But what Kennedy really did was he privatized Catholicism. The acknowledgement that secularism is not only the norm of American politics, but it is the preferred norm of American politics. That by saying that religion, how have we heard that since that Mario Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo, all the rest of the so-called Catholics? The idea is, well, I personally believe this, but as a public person, what's that saying? It's saying that God has nothing to do with the structure of a society. That the divine is an irrelevant intrusion. It is a private matter for everyone. This is exactly what's going on in the present administration with the HHS mandate. We're not stopping you from practicing your religion. You go to church anytime you want to. It's a private thing. It doesn't have anything to do with society in which we live. This is the legacy of this movement, The second thing that happened, or second, I don't know what number I'm on, another thing that happened was the Second Vatican Council. Pope Francis has tried to canonize it with John the 23rd and John Paul II. Fine. But it was interpreted by many almost as a secularist manifesto, just like the French Revolution. That it was an interpretation of the Council as assimilation to modernity, a modernity born in revolution and laying claim to the ownership of a political agenda based on human rights, just like the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution. This, by the way, is the root of the St. Pius X Society. It understands the Second Vatican Council's capitulation to the French Revolution. And it was put forth as an affirmation of the radical turn toward the subjective of the German myth-makers of the 18th through the 20th century. So it isn't that that's what the Second Vatican Council was, but it certainly was a popular interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. And so along with this alienation from root and source, the Second Vatican Council ended up being interpreted in the spirit of the Council as an affirmation of the Lockean Enlightenment, effect and foundation of American democracy. In the summary I gave you, I put in some quotes about the only theory of justice that there is a theory reached at by a democratic consensus. This is the Marxist principle. And this is something that is certainly the principle within the society in which we live today. And we have active and aggressive Marxists in the American political scene who call themselves something else. And maybe they don't even know that that's what they are. I don't know. The next thing that happened, was in the Catholic Church in the United States, there was what I call a metaphysical collapse. The loss of the given, the pragmatic reduction of the transcendent, the perceived intellectually irrelevant abstractions of the Middle Ages. In other words, all those abstractions and all that, what does that have to do with anything? The loss of the Trinitarian sense of God, humanity, and reality. Without the Trinity, the word image of God, imago Dei, in the Old Testament doesn't mean anything. It ends up with who looks like God in the end. It has nothing to do with that essential inherent participatory essence of the human person, which we have because God is essentially a relational being. And so in losing this sense of the metaphysical, losing this sense even of what we might want to call the mystical, the Catholic Church began more and more to imitate Protestant America and the people of the book. It's really interesting. During the resurgence of scholarship in the American Church in the middle of the century, the one discipline that really thrived was Scripture. It was refinding now the Bible, the book. And the origin and the source of the book became less and less and less important. And then you had something like this weird Jesus seminar business that's only the book. We're going to find in the book what Jesus actually said, and every year they found out he said less. I think probably in the modern world he probably didn't say anything by the time they were done with it. And that's where you get the famous ex-Irish Servite. He's an ex-Servite, not an ex-Irish Servite. He's an ex-Servite, John Dominic Crossan, who, if you ever watch the History Channel or any of those, whenever they want an expert, they call John Dominic Crossan, who doesn't believe in Jesus Christ. So that's kind of the way life is. But, and I also heard an unnamed member of the hierarchy who publicly mused as to why we had to deal with things as irrelevant as the Trinity. Why can't God just be God? That's the Islamic question. Because God is just God. He's not Trinity. He's not relational. We won't take that any further. Reduction. And so what happened then was Catholicism got reduced to a social and an ethical system, or simply another interest group. Clinging to the old Puritan book, but now enlightened because we now have learned 15 different languages to interpret it in. And therefore what we say must be true. As though the book itself, as though revelation itself is purely the property of the intellectuals. And the rest of us, such as we are, should dutifully listen. And that there is no life in it to inform my own soul, or yours, or ourselves as a people. In being reduced, then, to a social and ethical system, or interest group, the radical politicization of all corporate life after World War II and Vietnam, in the mid-century, the Marxist notion, derived from Aristotle's Politics, that all reality is created by the polis or the community, began to pervade American culture. Political activity became the sacred obligation of all members of a society. Actually, the only really public sacred obligation. Every other obligation was personal or private. The political, I remember I taught back in the early 90s at Kenyon College. It was kind of a world I wasn't exactly used to at the time. And I remember, hearing somebody say something about somebody that they thought, oh, they're so political. And I thought they liked them, And then I realized that was the highest compliment. They were political activists. Do you ever see anybody whose resume is an activist? I met somebody like that. I thought that was a straight activist about what. But it is because it is the fulfillment of the fundamental idea that the individuals in consensus create the reality. The individuals in consensus create the truth. The individuals in consensus define what it means to have justice. There is no given but the self. And so we talk about building a consensus. What have we identified? This whole gay marriage business is one of the strangest phenomena that I've ever seen. But it was a building of a consensus, a subtle, clever building of a consensus, which means once it is agreed upon by consensus within the society, it is the definition of justice. It has to be, because that's only right and just. That's what happens when there is no relationship to source, to origin, no anticipation of destiny. There is only what is. The truly human living requires performing all of one's, and this is a quote from a book called Marx and the Ancients. The truly human living requires performing all of one's natural activities in a way infused by rational choice and rationality. And that capability to function in this human way is not automatically open to all humans, but must be created for them by material and social conditions. Then, we'll look at that in a minute. Then the next quote from Marx and Aristotle. Democratic consensus, then, is the real basis for a theory of justice and a just society. Democratic consensus. What is the creator, therefore, of justice? The media, because they can control the consensus. When we look, for instance, at George Steiner's book, Real Presences, and he talks about the destruction of language, he has a great line in that, the tidal mendacity of journalism, that somehow or other, this very arbitrary element stands at the very root and the very foundation, and that politics then becomes the sacred obligation because it is through that activity you create the consensus that you want to justify whatever you want. To justify, in our day and age, writ large, that means gay marriage, abortion. Now we're having multiple marriage, and we have 3 lesbians and one of them is pregnant, big headline not so long ago. All of this is motivated. It has nothing to do with there is no given. None. Everything is created by democratic consensus. Pure Marxism, and purely much of the substructure of the American media. That whatever bandwagon they want to get onto, that's going to be the way it is. And they're effective. Look at it. It works. What happens, who knows? But there is no room for being self-revelation to man about humanity's nature itself, origin, destiny, self-understanding as society, as community. Nothing. Nothing. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Have you ever heard that the answer to the problem is education? Have you ever heard that? That's part of this. And it comes from the modern Aristotelians. The Germans turned back to ancient Greece. They excluded Aristotle's metaphysics, but they chose his ethics and his politics as kind of their book, having jettisoned. And actually, even in the middle of the 20th century, Reinhold Niebuhr, the great American Protestant thinker, admitted that the Bible was no longer an adequate norm, an adequate standard, and we really had to get beyond it. As did the Bishop of New Jersey, John Spong, in Christianity is now passé. We've moved into a new consensus society, and so there we were supposed to be. But in this Aristotelianism of the German philosophers, I call it like Aristotle with an umlaut. They kind of, took Aristotle and did with it what they wanted. But in this, Martha Nussbaum, who's now a professor at, I think, Northwestern Law School, but who was at Brown University, wrote a book called The Fragility of Goodness. And in there she posed the question, and I think I talked in the first time about the article by Harry Broad on philosophical education as affirmative action. Well, Margaret Nussbaum says in The Fragility of Goodness that she poses the question, well, if Aristotle was so brilliant, why did he support slavery? And her answer is this: because the culture was so corrupt that there was no way he had the freedom to see how evil it was. And had he been properly educated to the evil of slavery, then he would have been against it. What does that mean? It means that wherever culture is oppressive, if you educate people, they can get free from it. What about people who are pro-choice? What about people who are pro-life, They're oppressed by standard, ordinary structures of the society. They have to be liberated from that. They can't be given the floor to speak because they don't know what they're talking about. They have to be educated. And you see this happening in the schools. I don't know what the Common Core is. I have no idea, but I presume it's not good. I don't know. But it came from the government, so I'm sure. But on the other hand, we remember the big battle in New York City that they wanted to put the book Heather Has Two Mommies into the second grade or kindergarten or something like that. Educate the children about the goodness of lesbianism, of gay marriage, of abortion, of euthanasia, of all those kinds of things. And they'll get over these cultural traps that they're in, these cultural prisons that they're in. They'll be free then to choose the enlightened position, which the media struggles so hard to offer us that opportunity for freedom. In the end, I have what I call a definition of secularism. It's secularism that can be defined as a myth that is unconfirmed by being self-revelation in the Word. It is therefore a non-historical understanding of origin and destiny that ultimately conflicts with the pre-conscious knowledge of the human person. It is historically unsustainable, and it is always ultimately violent. Out of necessity to survive, it attacks the basic reality of the deepest truth of the human person. In our society, this violence manifests itself in a contempt for humanity, since humanity cannot affirm its mythological given. In the present time, it manifests this contempt in supporting the culture of death, abortion, euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, genocide, and it also breeds a pathological hatred of the Word, which is being's revelation of meaning and of destiny. As such, it is not truly wholly intellectual, but perhaps more a psychological phenomenon of great magnitude, and one which easily leads to a variety of forms of personal, political, and social madness. Nazism, communism, and all those leaders who represent the various forms of a descent into darkness. For does not being self-revelation warn us that only through the Word can we come to real truth? For Jesus said, no one goes to the Father but through the Son. Without going through the Son, the Logos, the Word, we enter into a form of madness. And that return to the Logos as the source of being self-revelation to humanity is a movement towards sanity, humanitarianism, and hope. In that, and I would just like momentarily to say, this is one of the great battles of Joseph Ratzinger, and one that he wrote into through his own personal pressure, the documents of the Second Vatican Council, Dei Verbum, that to overcome rationalism, not rationality, but rationalism and the tyranny of the book, he reconnected both back to being itself, and then encouraged us to understand that it is being itself, in the philosophical term, God, who interprets meaning for humanity through sacred scripture and through the tradition of the believing people. It is not scripture and tradition as the sources of revelation. It is the Word that is the source of revelation, that comes to us through scripture and tradition. And that without that reconnecting with the Word, with the Logos, the world sinks into a form of madness. And we have seen, and I said in the definition, it is always violent. It is the source of all that we have ideologically struggled with in the European empires and kingdoms after the 16th century. It is a reaffirmation of the disconnectedness of humanity from anything. And it ultimately leads, as the German philosophers so well and intelligently understood, into ultimately the chaos, the abyss, the primeval nothingness. Modern secular thought is a mad rush toward nihilism. And the only thing that stands between its success and the destiny and the future of humanity is very honestly the Catholic Church. And probably the Church of the East as well. When we cease to be true to who we are, we become part of the problem. When we reconnect with the Word, as Ratzinger urges us to do in De Verbum, and also in his dissertation and in his academic work for over half a century, what lay at the root and the foundation of it was the role of the Word is the given, the self-revelation of being to humanity, in which, through the use of reason and faith, we come to understand who we are and what this world is all about. And we come then to be able to contribute to the world. Not pragmatism, not bricks and mortar, not political success, but the truth of the reality of existence and of life. I hope that, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions. I tried to put together this in the précis form in this set of notes that I gave you. And I hope that I was, except on page 9 I have an error. I have is instead of are in the first sentence. The agreement of the verb with the subject was off. So I apologize for that. I hope it doesn't traumatize anyone, as it traumatized me. Okay. Do you have any questions? Any challenges or anything that you feel would be important to bring up at this time? Doesn't have to be. Okay. Oh, yes. Sorry.
You say that the church is the means by which we can do something good about what's happening. The church doesn't say that it is the means now. It has said it in the past, but now it's saying pluralism is legitimate. And once we say pluralism is legitimate, then any idea is legitimate. And I don't understand how we're going to get to where we need to be.
I think there's a difference between functioning in the world without conflict and drawing ourselves closer to the root and the source of our being. We acknowledge the fact that people have rights, individual rights, to disagree with the church, and that we should not annihilate them for doing that. But on the other hand, the problem becomes if we capitulate to our other ideas. And this is the struggle that's going on in Germany right now. And the idea that, in fact, as Bishop Zolich, Archbishop Zolich of Freiburg, has said, the consensus has changed in regards to the theology of marriage. So he's a Marxist. Clearly a Marxist, in the real sense, philosophical sense of that word. Do we have people, therefore, who are incompetent in the church? Well, we kind of always have. The world is more complicated and more complex. But this is the reason that Joseph Ratzinger hooked us back up necessarily to being self-revelation and to try to pull Catholic thought, reflection, and faith back toward its authentic origin. You can't do it by decree, apparently. And so it is a struggle. In the meantime, we try not to be at war with everybody. So do we say that, in a pluralistic society, what do we mean by that? Do we mean everybody has their own truth? I hope that's not what we mean. There is only one truth, and that truth is Jesus Christ as he reveals himself through Scripture and tradition. I hope we're not saying that. I'm very hopeful we're not saying that. I'm not saying that nobody says that. I'm sure many people say something very different than that. But I think as the center holds, as the core holds, that is the anchor that carries us through the storm, as it always has been. Yes?
We have leadership in the Catholic Church in America today that understand what you just said.
I don't know. I don't. I have no idea. Not been in conversation with them, but I really don't know. There's not a lot of indication that that's the driving force, which means that, this inheritance that we have, I mean, the people who are leading us today are the people who grew up in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. Mm-hmm. They certainly, without somehow or other deconstructing their own personal history, they're going to have a hard time getting there. But it's why we have to say and do the things we've always done. A good example of that is in the High Middle Ages. The whole idea of the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist is a biblically founded biblical story. As we moved away from that, we lost any understanding of how to explain it or understand it. What was intuitive for the first century was no longer intuitive for the 11th century, or the 12th century, or the 13th, or 14th, and so on. So we couldn't explain it. Now, we made a big attempt in 1215 to explain it in terms of scholastic philosophy, the idea of transubstantiation. And that held. Although the clarity of it was less clear than the biblical narrative, but we didn't understand the biblical narrative, so we didn't know that. The scholastic definition of substance is that by which a thing is what it is. So you change that by which a thing is what it is to something else that it is. That was sufficient. That worked intellectually for us for a long time. But the church continued to do what it had always done, even when it didn't understand what it was doing. It was faithful to its tradition, so much so that Ulrich Zwingli, the Swiss reformer, said one of the problems with the Catholic Church is Judaizing. And which means we were too connected to the Old Testament. We couldn't defend ourselves biblically in all of this because they didn't understand the Bible. They were the ones who changed the Bible from a source of revelation to something that they owned. A radical thing. But we always did what we knew we had to do because that's what we did. And so we confected the Eucharist. We celebrated the body and the blood of the Lord through all of the centuries of not grasping its Hebrew, its biblical foundation and understanding and principle. Our fidelity, when the human mind could not, that's what we do. Now, do we have... Yes. Will they be successful ultimately? No. Because the Holy Spirit has guided us and will continue to care for us. Will we be a mess? Yes. We have always been a mess. That's one of our charisms. But we survive with fidelity. And that's what we have to do. That's why it is so important what Ratzinger did. He was trashed for doing it as an academic. But when he got to the council as an advisor to Cardinal Frings, that was his final triumph and his ultimate revenge, if you would, is that he connected revelation back to the Word. And with that now, it's going to be very difficult for someone to say that isn't the way it is. So whatever else, the French Revolution, the combination of the French Revolution might have done for us as a church, that peace is the stability that we need to move through the crises. And do we have the personnel? Do we have the... I don't know. I really don't. Yes. Another question. Okay, yeah.
I'm really concerned about the way the media fawns over Pope Francis I. And it seems like every time they fawn over a pope, I see this cataclysm in the Catholic Church. They hated Pius XII. They had no use for Benedict XVI. But they loved John the 23rd, they loved Pope John Paul II, and they loved Francis I. Tell me that I have no idea what I'm talking about. Because I'm really concerned that we're back on the road we were when I was in high school in the 60s, and we're just going to become the feel-good church again.
Well, I was ordained in 1967, so I can, from another perspective, share that experience with you. I say, let us hope that's not the case. Let us hope that what they see in Francis is not what's there. Let us hope that they see the affirmation of the secular world's values and understanding and reason. Because he's not a rule giver. Let's hope they misunderstand him. And I presume that they do. Just like they misunderstood John the 23rd. What the consequences of this media frenzy will be, eventually they have to get sick of it. The media has to get sick of it, because he does say things like abortion is wrong and, marriage is integral and all of that kind of stuff. They ignore that because it's not what they want to hear. So they're creating a caricature, perhaps, of the man that they're holding up as the great example of Catholic enlightenment. Whatever happens, happens. We survived the 60s and 70s. I even survived the 60s and 70s. Battered and broken, but I did. And if we have to survive something like that again, we will. I think the idea is that we can't grab hold of the world and change it the way we want it to be. We have to be faithful instead, because it is the fidelity of the church which survived the Reformation. They could have said, oh, wait a minute, everybody's going in the other direction. Let's get on the train before it's too late. They didn't do that. They came close, but they didn't do it, even under tremendous pressure. And the interesting thing was, the one who kept the train on the track was the Pope. It wasn't the hierarchy, it wasn't the bishops. That's always been problematic. Back in the 11th century, when Gregory VII decided to take the church back from the German emperor, it caused wars for years and years and years. But Henry, and I think I quoted this before, Emperor Henry IV wrote a letter to Gregory XVII at the time, and the letter, in the first part of it, was true. Gregory VII had been the monk Hildebrand, and when Henry wrote to Pope Gregory VII, he said, to Hildebrand, not Pope, but false monk, I and all of my bishops say to you, descend, descend, and be damned throughout the ages. And all the bishops were on the emperor's side, and Gregory held the line. That's where the strength ultimately comes from, is from Peter. We're right to be concerned about who sits on the throne of Peter. On the other hand, we've been through some pretty bad times with all of that. But it is from the center that being self-revelation holds and anchors the church, no matter what the storms, the chaos, the apostasy, the disasters. And if it's uncomfortable and an unhappy and confusing time for us, think of the apostles when Jesus was crucified. It was a pretty confusing and unhappy time for them as well. So, yeah, so don't worry about it. Anything else? Okay. Whoops.
I guess I'd invite you to make a comment on obedience, maybe with obedience in respects to that mocking idea of our possession of ourself. Is obedience still possible with that understanding? And then obedience also with the idea of, with the lack of a giving, is there any meaningful form of obedience when there's no giving? So the question is, with secularism, is there any form of obedience that's possible?
Obedience to the consensus, and that's only possible through force, which we're experiencing. You know? Yeah. There is no core to it. And obedience is not some kind of a terrible negative concept, and it's not a totally passive concept either. You know? It means listening to, hearing, and responding. Everything, because of the Trinitarian root of reality, everything is relational. Obedience, therefore, depends upon, it is a relational phenomenon. And I think that we have to reinterpret it and understand it in that sense. I always interpret it as I can say what I want and do what I want until he told me to do something different, and then I did it. But no, obedience is ultimately saying,